It's easy to romanticize ancient Egypt. Golden thrones, jewels, pyramids, sphinxes staring out over the sand like silent gods. But if you were born a girl, life wasn't exactly a stroll by the Nile. Before we go further, if you enjoy quietly unraveling the past while drifting off to sleep, make sure you're comfortable, relaxed, and maybe even tucked in. This is going to be a slow journey through the lives of forgotten girls. Now picture this. You're a young girl, born into a dusty village by the river sometime around 1500 BCE. The sun is already beating down before you're old enough to understand what it means to work. You're not royalty. You're not even rich. You're just one of many, part of the laboring class, where life starts early and ends hard. By the age of 3 or 4, you're probably following your mother around. Not because it's cute, but because you're already expected to help. Fetch water from the well, grind grain on a heavy stone slab, watch your younger siblings while your mother cooks over a fire. Childhood as we know it didn't exist. There was no playtime, no school recess, no toys, unless you count sticks, mud, or maybe a broken pottery shard if you were lucky. If your family was especially poor, even food might have felt like a privilege, not a guarantee. The Nile was everything, a life source and a danger. You might swim in it, bathe in it, even wash your clothes in it. But you were also warned constantly about crocodiles and sickness. Clean water wasn't a given. Hygiene was limited. Disease was common. You learned early to be careful. Education? Only if you were a boy, and only if your family could afford to spare you from labor. Girls were trained at home. That meant learning how to bake bread, weave linen, sew garments, and keep the household in order. If you were born into a wealthier household, which, let's be honest, most weren't, you might also be taught how to manage slaves, track food stores, or prepare for life as the wife of a merchant or scribe. Puberty didn't come with awkward conversations. It came with expectations. You were considered marriageable by 12 or 13. No dating, no teenage years, just a quick and irreversible step from girlhood to wife, and very soon after, to mother. Girls were bartered off in marriage agreements, sometimes for land, sometimes for livestock. Your opinion? Not requested. And childbirth? It was dangerous. Midwives existed, and birthing stools were used to help the process. There were prayers and spells for protection, but medicine was basic. Infection, hemorrhage, breech births. Any of these could mean death. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, just your body, some herbs, and hope. But even worse than the physical toll was the lack of autonomy. You didn't pick your husband. You didn't decide when to marry or how many children to have. You didn't vote or own your own time. You followed the rules or you paid the price. Through social exile, punishment, or worse. Still, women weren't powerless. Some owned property. Some ran small businesses, brewing beer, selling cloth, even working as temple musicians. A few, like the rare female scribes or priestesses, rose in influence. And then there were the legends, women like Hatshepsut who ruled as pharaoh. But those were exceptions. Most girls, they lived quiet, harsh, invisible lives, their stories buried under centuries of sand. And yet, they endured. They found moments of joy in song and ritual and sisterhood. They passed down knowledge through hands and voices. They raised children, kept homes, survived droughts and plagues, and watched empires rise and fall. Close your eyes and let this forgotten world drift quietly into the back of your mind. In a home made of mud brick, packed tight against others in a cluster of winding alleyways, the day began with smoke and motion. Fires were lit before dawn, not for warmth, but to bake the daily bread. Your mother kneaded dough on a stone slab while you helped stoke the flame, eyes still heavy with sleep. The scent of baking, sweat, and ash clung to your skin like a second layer. one that wouldn't wash off easily. You'd carry water jars with your sister, walking barefoot over uneven, worn stone paths, careful not to trip or spill. The Nile was close, but not close enough. The walk was long and the jars were heavy, pressed hard against your young spine. You didn't complain. Complaining was for people with time, and you had none. The river gave life, but it also took it. You were taught never to get too comfortable near its banks. It teemed with spirits, with danger, with creatures that could vanish a child in seconds. Morning slipped into midday without pause. The sun pressed down like a hand on your back. Inside, your mother spun thread from flax or beat it into softness with a wooden mallet. You learned by watching, by mimicking, by bleeding your fingers raw until they toughened. Lessons were physical. Repetition replaced instruction. You swept floors, shook out mats, and rinsed out bowls while trying to keep younger siblings quiet. Silence was a kind of survival, especially when tempers flared or when your father came home early, sour from work or heat or wine. If you were lucky, you had stories, not written ones, spoken ones, old tales passed down in whispers, about gods with falcon heads and lioness eyes, about lost queens buried in forgotten tombs, about stars that listened and deserts that remembered. Stories were more than entertainment. They were maps and warnings, shields and songs. They showed you where you came from, even if they couldn't tell you where you were going. On some days, music would drift in. A flute played in the distance, a drumbeat echoing from a nearby courtyard, laughter from a wedding, or a newborn's naming feast. Life had escapes, but they were brief. A festival, a market trip, a holy day at the temple where incense clouded the air and everyone wore their cleanest linen. These moments were gifts, where the weight of womanhood temporarily lightened. But most days returned to the same routine. Work, dust, silence. Illness came often. A cough could linger for weeks. A fever might take a sibling in the night. A snake bite, a poisoned well. You understood death early. It was never abstract. You wrapped it in linen, kissed its face, and placed it in the earth. You didn't fear it. Not exactly. It was part of the world, like sunrise or sandals or sand. But you always knew it was near. You might have had a doll, carved from wood or shaped from clay, painted with faded red lines to show a smile. Or maybe you held a bead necklace passed down from your grandmother, the thread fraying more with each year. Something simple. Something to tuck beside you at night while the jackals howled beyond the walls and the wind stirred the thatch roof. The nights were cold, even in the desert. You huddled beside your sisters, wrapped in woven blankets, your mother's voice still lingering from a half-finished story. You dreamed not of riches, but of quiet, of a full belly, of waking to a morning where no one was missing. And when sleep came, it wasn't restful. It was light. Because at sunrise the coals would be stirred, the dough would rise, and everything would begin again. Your world was small. A few rooms, a courtyard, a stretch of path to the river, and the sky above, blazing and endless. But even in that tight circle, there were rules. You learned to read faces before you could read words. A glance meant silence. A frown meant work faster. Smiles? Rare but cherished when they came like a breeze in the heat of midday. You knew your place by watching how your mother moved around your father, how she paused before speaking, how she worked twice as hard when he was angry, and said half as much. You learned quickly when to stay quiet, when to disappear into the background, and when to nod even if you didn't understand. Marriage wasn't a question of if, but when. You listened as older girls whispered about the men they were promised to. Some were neighbors, some were much older, most were strangers. A deal between fathers, sealed with goods, sometimes a goat, sometimes a basket of grain, maybe a few jugs of beer. Your feelings weren't part of the transaction. You were part of the agreement, like livestock. but less discussed. When your time came, there was no ceremony with flowers or music. Just a change of house, a new set of duties, and the quiet goodbye of a mother who knew exactly what was ahead. You packed what little you had, a linen wrap, a comb, maybe a single bead necklace. Your role shifted, but the rhythm didn't. Rise early, cook, clean, bear children, repeat. Now with fewer people to lean on. There were good husbands, kind ones, men who shared their food and kept tempers in check, men who didn't raise their hands when they were angry. But not all were like that. Some shouted, some drank, some struck, and when they did, you endured, because there was nowhere else to go, no one to tell. Pain was private, endurance was praised. You might whisper to another woman in the market, or cry alone behind a wall, but never where anyone could see. Pregnancy brought both hope and fear. You counted the moons, felt the weight of new life, prayed to Taweret, the goddess who guarded childbirth. You whispered her name into the dark, clutched amulets made of ivory or clay, and hoped the pain wouldn't take you under. Midwives came with herbs and chants, oil and water. You sat on a birthing stool, held onto the hands of women who had been through it, and screamed into linen. Sometimes the baby cried. Sometimes you did. Sometimes neither of you did. Still, you found ways to survive. Women helped each other, shared herbs, shared secrets, shared silence. The community of women, sisters, cousins, neighbors, was its own kind of power. Together they stitched each other's wounds, both the ones seen and the ones hidden. They taught each other remedies, how to soothe colic, how to dress a wound, how to grieve without making a sound. Some days there was laughter, not loud, not carefree, but real, at the well, in the heat of baking, while braiding hair. There was rhythm in shared chores. There was peace in knowing someone else understood. In the cool of the evening, you might sit on the rooftop, weaving or sorting grain. Below, the village settled. Chickens in their cages, children chasing shadows, smoke curling from the last fires of the day. You looked at the stars and wondered if any girl like you ever changed her fate. You didn't dream of palaces. You dreamed of freedom, of choice, of rest. You didn't know about the scrolls that would be written by scribes or the tombs built for kings. You didn't expect to be remembered. But you left traces, in fingerprints on pottery, in worn paths beneath doorways, in lullabies that echoed through generations, in the quiet strength passed down from mother to daughter, again and again. And that was something no one could take. Not sand, not time, not even the gods themselves. You wake to the scrape of sandals on stone. The house is stirring. Another day, and you already feel behind. Outside, the sky is pale, the kind of color that comes just before the sun floods everything in gold and heat. You stretch, not for comfort, but to loosen the knots that sleep couldn't fix. The cold still clings to the clay walls, but the air is already shifting, warming, thickening. This morning, your mother is quieter than usual. Something's off. Her eyes stay low. You don't ask. You've learned not to. Instead, you follow her lead, collecting the worn baskets and clay jugs for the day's chores. There's grain to grind. There's linen to wash. The firewood pile is low. The bread is nearly gone. There's no time to linger. In the courtyard, you see neighbors. Women bent over fires, smoke curling around their wrists as they stir pots of lentils and barley. Children dart between shadows, chasing each other with scraps of cloth tied like tails, their feet slapping the stone. There's chatter, but it's soft and clipped. Everyone knows work comes first. The pace is slow but steady, and the rhythm is unspoken. It hums under the surface, like the flow of the river. Always there, always moving. You walk with your sister to the edge of town. The sun climbs quickly. You're old enough now to be trusted with errands, though never alone. There's no money exchanged, only goods. A bundle of onions for a flask of oil, a strip of leather for a pouch of salt, a spool of thread for 2 fresh eggs. The market is noisy, but it feels alive. It's one of the few places you can see the world outside your home. Even if you're still watched closely, judged quietly, weighed in glances. On your way back, an older woman stops you. She's missing teeth, but her eyes are sharp. She touches your wrist and murmurs a blessing under her breath. You don't know why. Maybe she saw something in your face. Maybe it's just habit. You nod anyway. It's best not to ask questions about omens or visions. Some say dreams mean something. Others say they don't. Either way, you'll remember it. Her touch, her voice, the strange heat that lingered in her fingers. At home, your aunt arrives with her baby tied to her back. Her feet are cracked, her eyes lined with worry. She's tired. Her husband's been gone for weeks, working on a tomb far upriver. She talks about the work, how men die there, digging in silence, breathing in dust and prayers. You wonder what those tombs look like. You wonder why the dead get more care than the living. The rest of the day is spent in quiet labor. You sew a tear in your tunic. You help your brother memorize the names of gods, Thoth, Isis, Osiris. You prepare lentils with garlic and dried coriander. You sweep the dirt floor. You chase a chicken from the doorway. The sun arcs high, then drops behind the flat roofs of the houses. Shadows stretch long across the walls like reaching arms. Your mother calls you to the back room. She unwraps a clay jar, old, chipped, but still sealed. Inside is honey, saved for something important. She spoons out just a little and mixes it with crushed herbs. She dabs it onto your temple. A protection, she says. Against what? She doesn't explain. Just closes the jar and says no more. At dusk, the family gathers. Your father's voice rumbles in the background, telling a story from his own childhood, one you've heard before, but still pretend is new. There's laughter, but it's gentle. Our mother hands you a bundle of herbs to hang by the door. For protection, she says again, her tone quieter this time. The fire crackles. Someone coughs. Outside, a dog barks and is answered by another. Later, you lie on your mat, arms tucked under your head. The air is cooling again. The stars are just beginning to show through the high window. You hear your sister breathing. You hear the quiet murmur of your parents, still talking, still planning. You close your eyes, not to escape, just to rest. As night falls, the silence deepens. The world outside disappears. Inside, the coals glow low, and your mind drifts. Tomorrow will look the same. But tonight, in this still moment, everything feels just distant enough to dream. A thin veil between memory and hope, between what is and what might be, if only in sleep. Sometimes, if you were fortunate or simply bold, you found small freedoms in the quietest corners. The rooftop at dusk, for instance, offered a kind of escape. You'd climb the rough, dusty steps when the chores were done, and the light turned soft. That golden hush that wrapped the village just before nightfall. The scent of the day, of cooking fires, crushed herbs, and sweat faded into the air. From up high, you could see the rooftops of others. Women brushing out tangled hair, men sipping lukewarm beer from clay cups, children chasing each other barefoot, their laughter rising with the wind like a prayer. The sky belonged to everyone, and for a few minutes each evening, it was yours, too. You learned the stars, not from maps, but from stories, from your grandmother's finger tracing invisible lines against the darkening sky. She'd name them for gods, for long-dead queens, for spirits that watched and waited. The gods lived up there, you were told, watching, listening, deciding. Their judgments were slow but final. Beneath that sky, you sometimes dared to think, not dream. Dreaming felt dangerous, but think about what else there was, about what lay beyond your village, past the fields of barley and flax, beyond the slow bend of the Nile, past the hard edge of the desert. You'd heard stories of Thebes, of Memphis, of foreign lands where people wore feathers in their hair and painted their skin blue. You knew you'd never go. Still, it helped to wonder. Wonder was quiet. It didn't leave marks. Downstairs, the world remained heavy. Meals were made, but often not enough. Flat bread, lentils, dried onions. Some days there was fish. Other days just broth. Arguments flared and died quickly, like dry twigs on flame. Everyone was tired. Everyone had their own weight to carry, and sometimes they dropped it on each other. You learned how to read a room without words, by breath, by movement, by the sound of someone setting a bowl down just a little too hard. You learned to step lightly, to vanish into corners, to wait until it was safe. There were rituals, though, routines that made the wait a little easier to bear. Washing your hands and feet before bed, even if the water was cold. Laying out your linen tunic for the next day, even if it was the only one you owned. Whispering a prayer to Isis or to Hathor or to anyone who might be listening. You weren't sure if they were, but it didn't matter. The act itself was something. A thread you could hold on to. On market days, the village changed its rhythm. People came in from the far edges, from reed huts near the marshes, from date groves, from the desert trails. They brought goods wrapped in linen, tucked in baskets, stacked in jars. Baskets of dates, jugs of honey, clay beads, painted amulets, and dried fish that crackled in the sun. The air buzzed with voices, loud ones, low ones, bargaining ones. You stood beside your mother, silent, watching, listening, learning how to count value, not just in goods, but in the way someone held eye contact, or in the pause between their sentences. You noticed everything: who was respected, who lied, who left with more than they brought, who held their chin high, and who kept their eyes down. These were lessons too, not written, not spoken, but absorbed through skin and silence, the kind you didn't forget. Sometimes, if your mother trusted you, she'd hand you a small coin and send you to buy salt or oil. It felt like power. You'd walk with your spine straight and your palms sweaty, rehearsing your words. The exchange was quick, but it stayed with you. You had done something. Moved in the world, even if just a little. Later, when you were older, maybe you'd pass those lessons to someone else. A daughter, a niece, a neighbor's girl who had no mother, someone who would walk the same paths and carry the same burdens. You'd show her where to stand in the shade when the sun was too much. You'd show her how to tie a jar to her hip so it wouldn't spill. You'd show her how to keep her face calm even when her heart wasn't. And you'd show her the sky, because it was still free, because the stars still whispered the same stories, because even in a life ruled by others, the sky was untouched, even if nothing else was. The end of a girl's life in ancient Egypt often mirrored the way it began, quietly, without much recognition, without much choice. There were no grand eulogies for most, no towering tombs carved into cliffs or pyramids that kissed the sky. Just a return to the dust and the heat, wrapped in linen, placed in a pit, sometimes beside loved ones, sometimes under a tree, sometimes alone with a handful of earth and a silent farewell. But death wasn't feared the way we often assume. It wasn't the end, not really. It was another crossing, a passage. The body might have broken down, grown tired, brittle, frail. But the spirit? That was something else, something enduring. That's what the elders said. That's what the priests chanted in the dim temples, where incense burned thick and sacred oils coated the dead. That's why you left food near the body. why you whispered spells into the wind, why you placed amulets beside the chest, over the heart, under the tongue. Protection wasn't just for the living. The journey continued. If your family could afford it, even in modest measure, you might be buried with small tokens: a carved wooden comb, a simple scarab, a belt woven by your mother's hands, a necklace of glazed faience beads that had dulled over time but still held color under the dust. Things that held meaning, not treasures of kings or generals, but pieces of a life. Objects that told a quiet story, not of power, but of presence, not of victory, but of endurance. Some girls never reached adulthood. The world was harsh. Illness could strike without warning. A fever, a cough that never left, a wound that refused to close. Childbirth was a gamble, often fatal. Accidents happened, and hunger lingered at the edges of too many lives. But these girls, these daughters, sisters, caretakers, they carried the weight of generations on their small shoulders. They cooked, they cleaned, they soothed, they remembered. They held families together with hands that never stopped moving. They learned rituals from their mothers, who learned them from theirs. How to bathe the dead, how to wrap the body, how to light the right incense at the right time. They kept the home sacred in a world where temples weren't always reachable and priests weren't always present. Their work was invisible but essential. Their names may not be in scrolls, their likenesses not carved in stone, but they mattered. They mattered in the lullabies they sang to restless children under a sky pierced with stars, in the way they stitched broken clothing by firelight, in the moments they touched a child's face or stirred a pot or taught a prayer. They passed down more than tasks. They passed down memory, recipes, warnings, blessings, superstitions, all wrapped in the rhythm of daily life. And the land remembered them, not in monuments, but in smaller things, in the grooves worn into grinding stones, in the soot stains on old hearths, in the broken bits of pottery buried under layers of time, in the softness of sand pressed by a kneeling child, in tools dulled by decades of use. Even the wind remembered, blowing through abandoned homes, with a hush that felt almost like breath. Even the sun remembered, warming the same stone thresholds 100 generations had stepped over. Not every legacy is loud. Some are quiet. Some are steady. Some never ask to be seen, but they endure just the same. Like the rhythm of the Nile, like the hands that shaped history without ever holding a title, like the girls who lived and worked and loved, and disappeared into the silence they helped hold together. In the quiet hours before dawn, the temples of ancient Egypt stirred with life, not with the booming voices of priests or the clang of golden staffs, but with small, rhythmic motions, sweeping, arranging, whispering. These were the rituals women often oversaw, tucked in the shadows, away from the pageantry of kings. These weren't ceremonies for an audience. These were acts of balance, of unseen power. They weren't loud, but they were vital. These rituals were the thread work behind the tapestry, quiet gestures that held the spiritual world in place. Girls watched and learned from their mothers. They saw honey mixed with herbs, fingers moving with practiced ease. Prayers were whispered, not chanted. Thresholds were swept not only for cleanliness, but to ward off what was unwelcome. A bowl placed facing the right direction, a pinch of salt tossed into a fire. These were not chores. They were layers of intention, passed from hand to hand. Every action held weight. Dusting a doorway was a form of protection. Lighting a lamp wasn't just for light. It was an invitation to the gods. Order wasn't just a concept of the state. It lived in the home, in every polished cup, in every offering of dates left on a shrine shelf. Most girls never stepped into the great temples as priestesses, but a few did. A rare few, chosen carefully, often from wealth or status or through family ties. These girls were shaved bald, draped in linen robes and entrusted with secrets few outside would ever hear. They learned the care of sacred idols, the correct way to wash the divine statues, the formulas for incense and the timing of chants. They walked silently through cool stone corridors, barefoot, alert, reverent. The work was exacting. You were not there to be seen. You were there to serve, to become part of the machinery of the sacred. For the many who never crossed a temple's threshold, religion lived at home. Household shrines were common. Small clay figures of Bes, the dwarf god who protected women and children, stood near cooking fires or tucked behind storage jars. Girls learned to touch these figures lightly each morning. They learned which amulets to wear: a blue eye for protection, a tiny cat for fertility, an ankh for life. These symbols weren't fashion. They were shields. Girls learned to pray not only for a good afterlife, but for daily safety, for their father's temper to stay cool, for the scorpion outside the door to crawl away, for the rains to come on time. Magic and medicine were braided together. There was no line between the two. Spells were spoken over wounds. Charcoal and crushed herbs were wrapped in linen to heal stings. Garlic mixed with oil was spread across chests to break fevers. A mother might whisper words while braiding her daughter's hair, not just for neatness, but to knot protection into each strand. Girls were taught that healing began with belief, and with knowing what words to speak, what roots to grind, what signs to watch. Even in death, these small rites followed them. The proper words had to be spoken over the body, or the spirit might wander. The right foot had to enter the grave first, or misfortune might follow the living. Mourning had its rituals. How long to wail, how long to wear dark linen, when to break the silence. These were acts of memory, and also of resistance. In a world that didn't write their names in stone, these rites were a way to be remembered. And it was in these quiet, consistent acts, washing, binding, feeding, chanting at soul, that girls left their mark. Not through conquest, not through wealth, but through care. They didn't rewrite scrolls. They didn't command armies. But they kept the home sacred. They carried belief on their backs and passed it down through their hands. They protected the future, not with swords, but with wisdom, patience, and devotion. These girls weren't written about, but they were everywhere, in every corner of every home, in the sacred silence between chants, in the softened cloth laid over a fevered brow. They were the keepers of rhythm, the guardians of the unseen, and in doing so they gave their lives a legacy, quiet, invisible, and indelible. Even in the hush of evening, when the desert cooled and shadows stretched long across the earth, a girl in ancient Egypt did not truly rest. The light dimmed, the air turned still, but the rhythm of her day continued, slower but unrelenting. There were always tasks: folding linen with tired hands, grinding grain for the next day's bread, settling disputes between siblings too tired to argue clearly. The work softened at night, but it never vanished. The home was everything. It was a shelter, a workplace, a sanctuary, and a prison. It was where you worked, where you slept, where you gave birth, and, for many, where you died. A small, square space, a single room, maybe two if your family was lucky or slightly better off. No privacy, no doors to close. Just shared breath, layered conversations, woven mats scattered across a dusty floor, flickering oil lamps casting shaky light on mud-plastered walls, and the constant hum of labor echoing through the cracks. By now you'd know every creak of the wooden beam above your head, every crack in the floor, every whisper of the wind that slipped through the reed roof. You could feel a sandstorm long before it arrived. In the shift of the breeze, in the taste of dust on your tongue. You could judge the weight of the day by how your mother set down her basket. You could read your father's silence like a script you had memorized, but never truly understood. These were your signs, your language, your survival. Marriage didn't guarantee safety. Some husbands were kind, patient, even loving in their own way. Some were cruel, loud, unpredictable. Most were simply indifferent. The balance of power never tilted in your favor. If you were widowed young, and many were, survival depended on your family, on how many sons you had, or on your ability to labor without complaint. Remarriage was common, but rarely about love. It was an arrangement, a transaction, and choice was often a luxury reserved for others. Still, women found each other. They formed quiet alliances. A neighbor who slipped you a few figs when your pantry was bare. A cousin who watched your children so you could rest your legs. A friend who helped you bathe your mother's body when she passed. These bonds were soft, unspoken, invisible to the world outside, but they held the world together. A kind of currency passed from hand to hand, moment to moment, heart to heart. Religion offered comfort, if not answers. You might pray to Hathor for love, to Taweret for protection during childbirth, to Isis for healing after illness. You learned these names not in temples, but from your grandmother's lips, from your mother's hands. The rituals lived in daily action, lighting oil lamps, muttering blessings, placing offerings of bread or herbs on dusty home altars. The gods were not distant figures. They were stitched into your life, folded into your breath, summoned in fear, in hope, in gratitude, in grief. At night, after the chores, after the arguments, after the fires were low and the children were asleep, you sometimes found space to think. Not always, but sometimes. About the sister you lost to fever, about the boy you never married, about the river, the gods, the stars. Questions you'd never ask out loud, not because they were forbidden, but because no one ever asked them, and maybe that silence was a kind of answer. You learned to endure without reward, to persist without applause, to carry burdens as if you were born holding them, and in a way, you were. Your back bent to the rhythm before you had the words to question it. Strength wasn't something you built. It was something you inherited, because this life, hard and silent, was passed to you like a story, unfinished, uninterrupted, told not in words, but in tasks, in rituals, in endurance, stretching backward into generations you'd never meet and forward into lives you'd never see. You didn't write it, but you lived it, and in doing so, you kept the whole thing from fading away. You made sure the thread continued. You were the link no one remembered but everyone relied on. And that was enough. In the stillness of early morning, before the market stirred and the animals called out for feed, a girl might find a rare moment to herself, just a sliver of quiet, a pause between duty and expectation. Maybe she stepped outside, feet pressing into the cool dust, eyes tracing the slow bend of the river. Maybe she didn't think about anything at all, not about chores, not about marriage, not about the way her hands already ached like her mother's, because thinking too much could hurt. It could remind her of things she didn't have the power to change. A mother's illness, a sister's bruises, a brother who never came home from work one day, a future already decided before she even knew how to spell her own name. She knew the rhythm too well. Be useful, be silent, be small. But for now, in that sliver of dawn, she didn't have to be anything. So she stayed in the moment. She watched the water. She listened to the wind brushing through date palms, to the distant bleating of goats, to her own breathing. It was all she could control. The village was still asleep. The air was cool, the earth still holding the quiet of the night. In that hush, it almost felt like the world belonged to her. Some girls were born with fire in them, though. Quiet fire. Not the kind that burned loudly, but the kind that stayed. The kind that simmered. They asked questions, even if they never spoke them out loud. They noticed things. They watched how the men spoke to each other, how the scribes moved their hands across papyrus, how temple doors opened when the right words were said. And they remembered. They remembered everything. How the priestess tilted her head before a chant, how the baker's son hid coins beneath the reed mat, how silence could mean safety or danger depending on who held it. They remembered who had soft eyes and who had hard ones, who helped and who pretended not to see, who whispered encouragement and who looked the other way. They learned how to stay safe, how to be invisible when needed, how to speak gently even when angry, how to read a room before entering it. They mastered the unspoken, the body language, the social currents. They became fluent in reading silence, and sometimes, even in that world, they carved out something for themselves, a role, a corner, a skill. Maybe they brewed better beer than anyone in the village. Maybe they wove cloth that even the priestesses admired. Maybe they knew a dozen healing herbs and could soothe a fevered child when no one else could. Maybe they sang songs that made babies stop crying. Maybe they remembered every birth, every burial, and carried those names in their heart like a record no one else kept. They didn't call it power. They didn't name it anything. But it was there, and it grew, not loudly, just like them, steady, patient, real. It wrapped around the cracks in the world and held everything in place. It made the impossible manageable. It turned another hard day into something survivable. Because survival wasn't just about breathing. It was about knowing when to bend, when to stand, and when to disappear. It was about protecting sisters, holding secrets, and carrying weight no one else could see. It was about enduring, not just pain, but boredom, injustice, repetition. About finding tiny joys like the sweetness of a fig or the sound of laughter through an open window. Sometimes the fire in them flared. In a moment of defense, in a whispered truth, in a quiet refusal to give in. And even if no one saw it, it mattered. It was resistance. It was life refusing to shrink. In a world that barely wrote their names, they wrote themselves into the days, into the things they touched, the people they loved, and the quiet strength they passed on without saying a word. They left no scrolls, no statues, no monuments, but their fingerprints were everywhere. In the homes that stood, the children who thrived, the songs that endured long after they were gone. And as the sun rose higher and the world woke, she would turn back inside, ready to begin again. Not because she wanted to, because she had to, and because somewhere, deep down, she knew. Her life was not nothing. Even if no one remembered her name, the world had been different, because she lived in it. You wake before the sun. The air is still, the kind of quiet that only exists in the hour before life begins again. When even the birds haven't started calling, and the only sound is your own breath. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake the others lying beside you. The woven mat beneath you creaks softly, the straw flattened and frayed by years of weight and wear. There's no time to stretch, no moment to ease into the day. The fire needs stoking. The dough must be kneaded. The water jars are already half empty, and your mother is already on her feet. So you start moving. Your feet brush over packed earth, toes catching on loose pebbles, and your fingers automatically reach for the tasks, waiting like they never really ended. You know this rhythm. It's in your bones. You don't think, you do. Sweep, stir, fetch, fold, stack, Washington. You don't wait for praise, and you don't expect rest. That's not what this life gives. But in the corners of the routine, those soft edges where the light hits just right, there are small things that keep you going. The warmth of the sun, when it finally breaks over the rooftops and spills like honey onto the ground. the sound of birds diving low over the fields, wings cutting through the air like whispers. The way your little sister still clings to your side, half asleep, trusting you more than anyone else in the world. There is beauty in the stillness, in repetition, in doing what needs to be done again and again with quiet hands and steady breath. The hours blur. The village hums with quiet labor. Women at fires grinding grain or weaving cloth. Children chasing shadows in the dust or playing with carved sticks. Men calling out as they carry baskets, build walls, or tend to animals along the edge of the fields. You know everyone. Their faces, their footsteps, their laughter. And they know you. You're not invisible here. You're expected, needed. Your absence would be noticed, maybe not spoken, but felt in the rhythm of things. Sometimes an old woman will stop you. She'll take your hands in hers and say something simple about strength or patience or how your mother would be proud. Her voice like gravel, her grip like rope, her eyes holding stories she doesn't say out loud. And for a moment, you believe it. For a moment, it feels like enough. Like you're not just surviving, but continuing something sacred. At midday, the heat is thick and unmoving. You sit in the shade with your sister, your backs pressed to a crumbling wall. You share a piece of flatbread, still warm from the fire. She asks a question you don't know how to answer, about the stars or the gods, or what happens when people disappear. You give her the only truth you know. We remember them. That's how they live on. In our work, in our names, in the way we carry what they gave us. Later, the sky turns a softer shade, and the smoke from cooking fires curls upward like quiet signals to the heavens. You rinse bowls in the river, the water cool against your fingers. You scrub your arms, splash your face, watch the ripples spread out and fade. The world begins to soften, just a little. Evening brings a hush, not silence, but something close to it, the kind of hush that settles over a village that has done its work. The chickens are quiet, the children are drowsy, the old men tell half-finished stories that wander off before they end, and you lie back on your mat, beneath a roof, patched and mended over years, your sister's breath slow and even beside you. Tomorrow will come. The fire will need stoking, the bread will need kneading, the jars will need filling. But for now, you rest. And the world, for a few brief hours, feels still again, like it's holding its breath, just for you. Sometimes a girl in ancient Egypt found herself close to power, not wielding it, but brushing up against its edges like a shadow passing over stone. Maybe her father worked in a palace as a carpenter or an animal keeper. Maybe her aunt was a wet nurse to someone whose name history would remember. That nearness didn't guarantee a better life, but it shifted something. It changed the air she breathed. It made her more alert, more cautious, more attuned to the hierarchies that ruled every moment. She learned to listen more closely, to step more softly, to read the tone in someone's silence. She watched who bowed and who didn't, who smiled too wide and who didn't smile at all. There was a rhythm to power, and she picked it up the way some children pick up melodies, without effort, without being taught, just by being there. Inside those grand homes, things looked different from her own cramped mud brick house. The walls weren't plain. They were painted in colors she didn't know the names of. The floors were covered with woven mats or polished stone, cool underfoot. Bowls weren't made from clay, but from bronze or alabaster. Food was served on plates instead of shared from a single pot. There were mirrors, actual mirrors, not just polished copper. Fragrances hung in the air, myrrh, lotus oil, and something she couldn't describe but would never forget. The work still had to be done, of course. Meals prepared, floors swept, laundry soaked and beaten and hung. But in these households, labor was cloaked in ritual, layered in rules, paced by protocol. She might help prepare oils for the lady of the house, folding linen precisely, stirring perfumes slowly over warm coals. She might stand silently in a corner, watching as scribes recorded inventories in perfect lines, dipping their reeds into ink pots made of ivory. But even in proximity to privilege, a girl remained on the outside. She wasn't educated with the boys. She wasn't taught how to read or write, even though she passed scrolls daily. She wasn't trained in the arts of law or leadership. Her role was support, observation, imitation. She learned how to speak only when spoken to, how to bow her head just enough to show respect, but not so low as to appear weak. A glance could mean offense. A misstep could mean dismissal, or worse, banishment from the household. Shame brought back home. Still, there were slivers of fascination. The perfumes, the flowing garments dyed in indigo and saffron, the jewelry that caught sunlight like captured stars, the music drifting through wide halls, the sound of flutes, lyres, and hand drums carried on the breeze, the chance to glimpse visiting nobles with painted eyes and golden bangles that clinked with every movement. And in the quiet moments, she might dream, not of ruling, but of something simpler, a marriage with kindness, a life without fear, a future where her daughters might choose their own days, even if just a little. She knew better than to say these dreams aloud. Dreams were dangerous, but they lived in her, like a tiny flame tucked into the corner of her chest, flickering but steady, waiting for air, for chance, for a moment when the world might be soft enough to let it grow. The world around her never promised fairness, but it offered moments, a cool breeze through a shaded corridor, the smell of bread rising in the kitchens, the kindness of an older woman who remembered her name, who smiled without expectation. A task done well and praised in a whisper when no one else was listening. These were the things she carried. Not gold, not status, but something quieter. Dignity, endurance, a quiet grace learned in stillness. A deep, unwavering awareness that even on the edge of power, you could still choose who you were inside. And that choice, invisible, unrecorded, uncelebrated, was its own kind of strength, one that no title could grant and no history could erase. Sometimes being a girl in ancient Egypt meant learning how to disappear, not out of shame, but survival, to blend into the background, to stay quiet when men talked, to lower your gaze in front of strangers, to step aside without being asked. These were not written rules, but they were memorized like prayers, passed down with the same certainty as how to knead dough, carry water, or braid hair without pulling too tight. The women taught the girls, not just how to sew or cook, but how to read a room, how to feel the shift in a man's voice, how to listen without being noticed, how to speak softly, say just enough, and never more, how to carry your sadness in your shoulders and still get everything done, how to smile when you didn't feel like it, how to find peace in the smallest things, a patch of shade, a moment of stillness, the smell of bread before sunrise. You might have laughed sometimes, a real laugh, maybe with a friend as you fetched water, joking about the neighbor's loud donkey, or the boys who tripped over their own sandals. You might have whispered secrets behind woven baskets, hearts racing with joy you couldn't explain. You might have had a favorite song that only your sister knew, a favorite scent from your mother's cooking, a memory of the river that made you feel safe. You might have dreamed of something, not grandeur, but freedom, space, air, a life with just a little more choice. But you were always aware of your place. There were temples where you couldn't go, sacred spaces guarded by status and gender, rooms where men discussed laws and trade while you poured wine or cleared scraps, doors that were never meant to open for you. Even among gods, most were male. Even in the afterlife, there was order. And it didn't begin with you. Still you created. Not pyramids, but moments. Not scrolls, but memories. You made warm food when there was barely enough grain. You washed the same clothes 100 times. You quieted a crying child at midnight while the rest of the house slept. You brought rhythm to chaos, comfort to tired bones. You remembered birthdays, offerings, stories, the things everyone else forgot. You reminded, you comforted, you stayed, you fixed what broke. A torn robe, a burned pot, a tense silence in a room full of tired people. You stitched it back together without being asked. Your hands never stopped moving, even when your heart was heavy. History doesn't mention you. The scrolls speak of kings and soldiers, merchants and scribes, not of the girl who woke up before dawn to grind grain for people who never said thank you, not of the woman who held a family together through nothing but grit and repetition. But that doesn't mean you weren't there. You were the silence between rituals, the shadow at the edge of a procession, the hands that lifted a crying baby from the floor, the voice that sang in the background while others spoke of destiny. You were the one who knew where everything was, the one who remembered which herbs to use, which words to say, what time the sun hit the garden wall. You weren't carved into stone, but you were the one who helped everyone else stand. You were never written about, but you were everywhere, in every home, in every heartbeat of a day that could not have continued without you. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, Ma, but because that's when the world begins. The cool air clings to the walls like a blanket left out overnight, and for a brief moment, the silence feels like a rare kind of gift. But then, almost without warning, the day begins. Voices murmur like low waves. Footsteps echo on hard-packed earth. Firewood crackles as sparks snap into the morning air. Your body aches before it even moves. Your joints are stiff, your back tight. There's no softness where you sleep, just a mat, a thin blanket, maybe a cushion if you're fortunate, or if your mother decided you needed one more than she did. You stretch quietly, listening for what's needed before anyone has to ask. That's how you survive. By noticing, by anticipating, by staying ahead of the voice that might call your name too sharply. Outside, the courtyard is already alive. Someone is sweeping with a bundle of reeds. Someone else is pounding grain in a heavy stone basin. The animals stir. Goats bleating from a corner pen. Chickens scratching at the dirt. The light creeps slowly over the mud brick walls, soft and gold at first, before it becomes white and merciless, pushing down on every surface like a weight. You help prepare the morning meal. Bread from the dough mixed the night before. A porridge made from barley. Lentils, maybe. Dried fish if the week's trade was good. You learn the rhythm of feeding others before feeding yourself. That's the rule. That's always the rule. There's no time to pause. There are clothes to rinse and lay out in the sun. There's water to draw, haul, carry. The jars are heavy, shaped to be cradled against your hip, your back, your head. You don't think about it anymore. You just move. To think is to slow down, and slowing down means falling behind. You watch your mother's face like it holds tomorrow's weather. You can tell what kind of day it's going to be by how she knots her hair, by how she sighs, by the sharpness in the way she reaches for her tools. You learn how to read moods like others read the stars, carefully, constantly, knowing the sky can change in an instant. Later, there may be sewing, mending, grinding herbs for a neighbor's sick child, helping a friend weave linen in exchange for a handful of dried dates or a splash of oil. Tasks multiply as the day stretches. You don't count on rest, but sometimes you steal it. A moment of stillness when no one's watching. Long enough to let your hands stop aching. Long enough to let your breath deepen without guilt. The sun climbs higher. Shadows pull in tight beneath the awnings. The village hums, not with joy, but with the persistent rhythm of survival. Each house, each courtyard, each narrow alley is part of a living machine. You are a moving piece of it. Not because you chose it, but because it's the way of things. It's what life is. And still, in brief flickers, something stirs inside you. A thought, a wish, a memory you didn't live but feel anyway. Something soft, small, persistent. A sensation that there is more than this endless cycle. You don't have words for it. You wouldn't speak them even if you did. But it stays with you. Like breath. Like hunger. Like hope. Then the tasks return. There's grain to sift. A floor to sweep. A sibling to soothe. The hush of a private world fades into the clatter of the real one. And so you return. Quietly. Just as expected. By the time a girl reached her final years, if she was lucky enough to reach them, her body had long been shaped by the labor of decades. Wrists stiff from grinding grain each morning before the sun rose. Knees worn from squatting by low fires, cleaning fish and scrubbing floors. Shoulders bent from lifting water jars. Eyes dimmed by smoke and sun, and the strain of thread counting under flickering lamplight. But with age came a different kind of power, one that didn't announce itself with volume or position, but settled quietly in the way others made space for her. She may not have had titles or land, but her knowledge carried weight. Generations moved through her memory. She was the one people came to, with questions, with worries, with silence. About childbirth, about healing herbs, about when to plant, about how to store grain before the flood season, about what a certain dream might mean. She knew how to read the skies for signs, how to feel a fever through the skin, how to calm a crying child with just the right hum or pressure of a hand. She became a keeper of rhythms, of the seasons, of the household, of the human body. The younger women watched her closely, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't need to. Her presence held weight. Her pace was steady. Her words were measured. When she did speak, people listened, not just out of respect, but because she had survived. And in a world like theirs, that meant something. That meant everything. Even in a society that often placed women in the background, the passing of time could bring a woman forward. She might be invited to sit near the temple during festivals, or asked to help with purification rituals. She might be chosen to lead the chants at a family funeral, to speak the final blessing, or to anoint a newborn with oil and ash. Her authority was unwritten but deeply understood, woven from memory, not just her own, but those passed to her by mothers, grandmothers, and generations before them. Each life added to her layers. She held the stories, not the grand myths of gods and kings, but the quiet stories that kept a household breathing. What to do when the barley fails, how to mend a tear in fabric without it showing, how to sing a child back to sleep after a night terror. What to do when grief settles in and will not leave, even after the ritual days have passed. She didn't need scrolls. The knowledge lived in her hands, in her movements, in the pauses she let hang in the air, and in the still of the night, as the village slowed and others slept. She often stayed awake just a little longer, sitting by the doorway, feet wrapped in cloth, eyes tracing the stars that had watched her since she was a girl, listening to the breath of those she had raised, not guarding, not worrying, just being, just existing in a space she had earned through time, through loss, through care, through relentless endurance. Her name may not have been carved in stone, she may not have been painted in tombs, but her hands were everywhere, in the bread that fed a family, in the linen that wrapped the sick, in the water carried from the river, in the fire that warmed a newborn, in the hush of a lullaby, in the wisdom spoken softly into a daughter's ear, in the shape of the day itself. She wasn't forgotten, because forgetting her would mean forgetting how to live, and that was something no one could afford. That, too, was legacy, and it lingered, in the dust, in the bones, in the breath of every girl who came after her. In the quiet hours of night, when the fires burned low and the village settled into sleep, a girl in ancient Egypt might lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling above, her body still, but her thoughts drifting. The sounds outside were faint, the rustle of palm fronds in the wind, the distant call of a night bird, the creak of rope on a moored boat swaying gently. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. It was in these moments when the labor paused, when the heat of the day finally gave way to a cooler breath of air, that the mind began to stretch beyond the mud brick walls. She might think about the stars, not just as lights in the sky, but as gods, as ancestors, as protectors, as stories frozen in motion. Her grandmother once told her the stars were the souls of the dead, watching over those below with silent patience, that each spark above had a name, that every soul became a light, and that one day, if she lived well, she too would rise to join them and be remembered in the sky. Her fingers might trace the edge of a woven blanket, rough and worn, as she imagined lives beyond her own. Dreams weren't big. They couldn't be. Not in a world that offered so little space for women to want anything beyond survival. But even small dreams held meaning. Maybe she hoped for a gentle husband, one who didn't raise his voice or his hand. Maybe she dreamed of a child that lived past infancy, a garden that bloomed in dry seasons, or a quiet corner of a house that was hers alone. Maybe she imagined being remembered, not by the world, but by her children, and their children, and whoever came after. Remembered not for greatness, but for goodness. Magic, too, was never far from her thoughts. It was stitched into daily life. It lived in the amulets tied around her neck, shaped like eyes or scarabs or ankhs. It curled in the ink markings on her brother's wrist, meant to keep evil spirits at bay. It hummed in the whispered words before sleep, protective chants passed down for generations. She believed in spells, in curses, in the sacred power of names. She knew which herbs to burn when a child was fevered, which oils to rub on aching limbs, which prayers to murmur when the moon was full, or when dreams turned strange. The world was dangerous, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unseen hands. Sometimes she would slip from under her blanket and sneak away from the house. Just for a moment. She wasn't supposed to, but the night felt different. The Nile was quieter then, slower, reflective, like it too had grown tired of the day. She'd walk barefoot, careful not to wake the others, and make her way to the riverbank. There, beside the reeds, under a sky thick with stars, she'd dip her fingers in the cool water and close her eyes. She'd make a wish, soft, unspoken, and unsure who was listening. She didn't need temples. The river was sacred enough. In that solitude, surrounded by reeds and starlight and the pulse of ancient water, she might feel, just for a heartbeat, that she was more than her role, more than a daughter, a future wife, a vessel for labor and life, that she was part of something older, something wider, something that pulsed through every grain of sand and every breath of wind. That being small didn't mean being unimportant, that there was power in quiet. Sometimes she'd pick up a small rock and hold it tightly, as if it could anchor the moment, keep it real. She knew morning would come too soon. The fire would need tending, the jars filling, the floors sweeping, the same cycle, the same weight. But for now, in the hush between darkness and dawn, under a sky heavy with memory, she belonged to herself, and that was enough. For tonight, that was everything. The walls of ancient homes held more than just warmth and shadow. They held secrets, And some of those secrets belonged to the women who practiced quiet forms of magic, healing, and protection when no one else would. It wasn't showy. It wasn't loud. It was woven into the corners of everyday life, like dust in a sunbeam. These weren't the grand rituals of temple priests. There were no golden headdresses, no crowds, no chants echoing off stone walls. These were private moments, intimate acts. A mother whispering a protection spell over a child's cradle while rocking it gently with her foot. A midwife muttering sacred words while tying a knot in a cord during childbirth, sweat dripping from her brow. A girl scratching symbols into the dirt behind the house, just in case the gods were watching, just in case it helped. Magic wasn't rare. It was everywhere. It was in the bread dough as it rose, in the water sprinkled across the threshold, in the band someone tied around your wrist when you were sick. People didn't just believe in it, they relied on it. Like sunlight. Like breath. There were charms to keep scorpions away, amulets to guard against the evil eye. Recipes for healing made from garlic, honey, date pulp, and crushed stones. And when none of that worked, there were prayers, not the temple kind, but the soft, desperate kind, whispered under your breath when no one else was listening. Girls learned these things not from books, because there were none in their hands, and not from teachers, because few had formal instruction. They learned from watching, from repetition, from the things their mothers said while kneading dough, or the warnings their grandmothers gave when the wind changed. They learned how to sense when a room felt wrong, how to cleanse a space with burning herbs, usually myrrh or juniper, how to spit 3 times when misfortune was mentioned, how to knock on wood or braid a string a certain way to trap bad luck. Superstition wasn't just habit, it was armor, a way to feel in control when control was never yours to begin with. Some women were known for it, not officially, not publicly, but people knew. They weren't called witches. They weren't feared, not at first. They were respected, quietly. People went to them when nothing else worked, when illness didn't break, when livestock started dying, when a baby wouldn't sleep, or a husband kept seeing bad omens in his dreams. These women offered advice, brewed bitter teas, gave out poultices that smelled awful but worked. They told stories with meanings folded into the middle, like secrets wrapped in linen. But there was danger too. If your remedies failed too often, if someone powerful grew suspicious, if a misfortune followed you too closely, it could all shift. Praise could turn to whispers, whispers to avoidance, avoidance to accusation. One day, you're the woman people trust with their sick children. The next, you're the one they cross the street to avoid. A broken jar blamed on your presence. A bad harvest pinned on your stare. Even so, they practiced. Because life was fragile, and belief was powerful. And even if no one saw the work, it mattered. It wasn't about glory. It was about survival. About keeping people safe when the world around them felt chaotic and cruel. About using what little you had, herbs, stories, whispers, to shape something better. In the quiet hours before dawn, a girl might trace a symbol on the inside of her wrist. Not with ink, but with a finger. Something her grandmother showed her once. A spiral for protection, a dot for health, a slash for strength. She'd hold it there a moment, eyes closed, heart steady. For luck, for safety, for a world that never truly felt safe. And then she'd wipe it away before anyone saw, and go on with her day like nothing had happened at all. Because that was the way. Quiet, hidden, but never powerless. In the quiet corridors of Egyptian temples, behind the colossal statues and sacred altars, there were women working, unseen but essential. They swept the floors with straw brushes, cleared ashes from the offering fires, and kept the shadows tidy. They prepared offerings with practiced care, slicing fruit, arranging flowers, laying out bread still warm from the ovens. They brewed oils, blended perfumes, crushed herbs and resins into thick pastes, mixing scents into something holy. They weren't priestesses, not most of them, but they kept the place breathing. They kept it from falling into silence. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were the beating heart of the city. Religious centers, yes, but also schools, banks, and bureaucratic hubs. They owned land, employed farmers and herders, trained scribes, and stored grain in enormous silos. And tucked within that vast machinery, some girls found roles that were different from what most others knew. A position as a temple worker could mean steadier meals, safer housing, a small measure of consistency. Not power. Not quite. But dignity, in a world that often denied it to people like you. You might have woken up before the sky turned blue, your fingers stiff from the cold desert night. You'd stumble through the dark corridors, oil lamp in hand, to light the larger lamps for the first ceremony of the day. You'd carry trays of figs, loaves, roasted meat, and jugs of beer or water, carefully laid out for the statues that represented the gods. Every movement had to be precise. You learned when to speak and when to stay silent. You learned the rhythm of the chants, when to bow, when to retreat. The smell of incense stuck to your skin. The echo of footsteps on stone stayed in your ears long after the workday ended. Sometimes the temple singers rehearsed nearby. Their voices moved like silk over stone, high, sharp notes rising and falling, weaving into the murmurs of prayer and the crackle of firelight. You might pause at the edge of the courtyard just to listen. If you closed your eyes, it felt like the gods were listening too. It felt like your breath had joined something larger than you. But even in these sacred spaces, you weren't untouchable. The temple had rules, and the rules had sharp edges. Your tasks were assigned. Your behavior watched. If you disobeyed, if you showed too much curiosity, if your tone was wrong, punishment came. A transfer to a harsher post, a day without food, a public rebuke, or worse, being sent home. And home, for many, meant hunger, harsh voices, fewer options. Still, temple life offered a narrow path to something softer, something more predictable. There were friendships. You and the other girls shared chores, traded whispers during breaks, covered for each other when someone was too tired to finish a task. There were little moments of warmth, shared dates, laughter over a crooked batch of bread, quiet songs hummed while sweeping the floor. You learned how to read a room without anyone saying a word. You learned to watch the older women, the quiet, efficient ones who seemed to carry authority in the tilt of their heads and the calm in their silence. Sometimes you saw things others didn't. A scribe dropping a scroll, a priest lingering too long near the wine jugs, a statue that caught a certain light and looked almost alive. You kept those observations tucked away. They didn't belong to the world of rules. They belonged to the in-between. And in rare moments when no one was watching, you might sit near the sanctuary wall, not too close, not where you'd be seen, and whisper your own thoughts. Not formal prayers, just quiet hopes, a plea for rest, a wish for fewer bruises, a dream of walking somewhere new. You didn't expect answers. You just wanted to speak somewhere the words might linger. You never expected to be remembered. You knew your name wouldn't be carved into stone. You knew your image wouldn't be painted on tomb walls. But you hoped, somewhere deep, that something in the temple remembered you anyway, that the worn edges of the floor would recall your steps, that the smoke in the rafters would remember the rhythm of your breath, that the gods, even if they never spoke, had noticed your offering. Not the one on the tray, but the one you made every day just by showing up and staying and working without being seen. In the market square, the world moved with a slow, dusty rhythm. Merchants called out their prices in sing-song tones, swatting flies away from baskets of dates, figs, and drying herbs. The sun cast long shadows between stalls. Clay pots clinked as they were lifted, examined, and set down again. Fabric rustled in the breeze. Linen dyed in soft ochres and deep blues fluttering like banners above the crowd. But beneath the surface of trade and chatter was something quieter, something invisible unless you knew how to look. You were there not to shop, but to help, carrying bundles, minding children, fetching forgotten items, listening for the signs of a bad deal. Your mother's voice was calm but sharp, like a knife wrapped in linen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried weight, even when they were barely louder than a whisper. She knew who to trust and who to avoid. You watched her closely. Every word, every glance, every pause, all part of a dance older than the walls around you. The market had rules, and she moved through them like a seasoned performer. Markets weren't just about goods. They were about news. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Who had fallen ill? Who had married? Who had been punished? Whispers about omens, visions, strange things seen near the river. You learned to listen without reacting, to stand still, hands full of grain or cloth, and hear everything without showing it. A girl who showed too much interest risked becoming the next rumor. Sometimes, you caught glimpses of the other world, the world of scribes and priests, of soldiers and tax collectors, men with scrolls tucked under their arms and gold-painted collars around their necks, men who never looked down at you. Their lives seemed distant, full of laws and plans and judgments, but they touched yours all the same. A new tax could mean less food. A soldier's mood could change your mother's safety. The decisions of strangers carried weight in your kitchen. Once, a scribe passed close, and you caught the smell of ink and papyrus. Strange, foreign scents that clung to him like smoke. You wondered what his life was like, if he'd ever had to fetch water, if his mother's hands were as cracked as yours. Still, you moved through it, with your head low, your eyes sharp, your hands steady. You learned when to speak and when to stay silent. You learned that silence could be power. You saw your mother end a deal with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. You learned how to stack goods so they looked more valuable. You learned to spot a cracked pot before anyone else did. These were skills just as sacred as writing or battle. And in rare moments, you smiled. When a song played from a group of traveling performers, when a neighbor handed you a fig without asking for trade, when someone told a joke just loud enough to make nearby children laugh, when a baby giggled and forgot the world was hard. Those small things, they stayed with you longer than the heat or the hunger. They were yours, private treasures stored in the softest corners of your memory. And when the day ended, and the market began to empty, and the sun dipped low over the mud brick walls, you walked home beside your mother, tired, dusty, hungry, but full of things you couldn't name. 100 impressions from a single day, 100 unspoken lessons, and in a life with few choices, the things you could carry in your heart meant everything. In the stillness of the temple courtyard, long after the priests had gone and the fires had dimmed to soft embers, the air held a weight, not heavy, but ancient. This was the hour when the world paused, when the stars overhead seemed to lean in closer, when silence wasn't just the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, steady, watchful, and deeply felt. If you were a girl allowed inside these sacred walls, perhaps because your family worked the temple grounds, or because you carried water to the priestesses during festival days, you would have seen what most never did. Rows of towering columns painted in deep reds, golds, and faded blues, their pigments flaking but still alive under torchlight. Statues with calm, eternal eyes staring into eternity. Incense trails curling like spirits into the night air, blending with the scent of oil and stone. You would move quietly, not out of fear, but because quiet was expected. Every step had meaning. Every glance could offend. These were not places built for girls, not typically. But in rare moments, if you were still enough, if you kept your hands folded and your eyes low, you could catch pieces of ritual. The lifting of a hand in invocation, the soft murmur of a chant rising like breath, the steady echo of a drum marking time not just for worshippers, but for the gods themselves. Temples were more than houses of gods. They were vaults of memory. They held scrolls of law and medicine, jars sealed with the names of ancestors, relics left by generations long buried, shelves that held not just offerings, but lives. And if you stood inside long enough, you began to feel the weight of all those hopes, pressed into stone, spoken into dark corners, whispered into cracks in the floor. Thousands of them. Wishes carried on breath, pleas spoken in desperation. Gratitude left in baskets, bread, honey, dates, a feather from a sacred ibis. Sometimes you would help clean, sweep sand from corners where it always returned, polish the floor with crushed reeds, wipe soot from carved walls. It wasn't glamorous, but it brought you closer to something larger than yourself. There were times when you felt watched, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, as though the gods, or maybe just the space itself, saw you. There were rumors, always whispered, that some priestesses had once been girls like you, born poor, unnoticed, until someone saw potential, chosen, lifted out of the dust and into the rhythm of sacred life, taught to read the sacred texts, trusted with rituals that shaped the seasons. Maybe it was myth, maybe not, but in that quiet, beneath the carved gaze of stone deities, anything felt possible, even transformation. You didn't need permission to feel reverence. You didn't need to recite every word or light every lamp. You just needed a moment, a breath, a stillness, a glimpse into a world older and deeper than anything outside the temple gates, a silence that stretched wide enough to step into, a pause where even someone without a name carved in stone could feel like they belonged. You would return home before the sun rose, before the city stirred, but you carried that stillness with you. It stayed on your skin, in your breath, in the quiet ways you moved through the rest of your day. In a world that asked much and gave little, you had brushed against something sacred, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. Imagine standing at the edge of a dusty field, just as the sun slips below the horizon. The heat of the day fades, melting into a dry, heavy stillness. The light softens, the shadows stretch. This is when the elders speak, not loudly, but with the weight of time behind every word. You, a girl barely grown, sit with your knees tucked to your chest, listening. Because in ancient Egypt, stories weren't just entertainment. They were tools, shields, instructions for surviving a world that asked everything of you and promised little in return. Some stories were of the gods, wild-eyed, animal-headed beings who argued, loved, destroyed, and created. Horus with the falcon's eyes, Bastet, gentle and fierce, Set whispering chaos in the corners of the earth. But just as many were stories of daily life. How to store grain so the rats wouldn't get it. How to keep a fire going with damp wood and brittle kindling. How to know if someone was lying, not by what they said, but by what they didn't. The twitch of a lip, the glance of an eye. It wasn't magic, it was memory. Wisdom passed down in whispers, shaped by wind and repetition, anchored in survival. The women knew the most. They always did. not because they were taught, but because they had to know. They carried generations of hard-earned knowledge in their bones and fingertips, not the kind written in scrolls or carved into walls, but the kind you lived through. Remedies made from crushed herbs mixed with spit and prayer. The exact moment to cut the umbilical cord. The right time to say nothing at all. How to keep a house sacred, even if it was falling apart. Their words weren't preserved in temples. They lived in cracked hands, furrowed brows, and steady eyes that had seen too much and still saw clearly. By this time in your life, you'd seen enough to know the world wasn't fair, but you'd also learned how to move through it, how to get by, how to shrink when needed, how to hold your ground when it mattered, how to disappear into a crowd, how to speak just loud enough to be heard by those who needed to hear you, and no one else. Power wasn't about shouting, it was about timing. Survival was its own kind of mastery. Evenings were the only time the world slowed down. The heat lifted, the tools were put away, meals were simple, lentils, onions, a slice of coarse bread if it had been a good day. If the harvest had gone well, maybe there was a fig or two. If not, water would have to do. But even that water, cool and pulled from a jug, felt like a gift. You sat on the floor, surrounded by others. You shared what you had, and that mattered more than anything. You laughed sometimes. Real laughter. You exhaled. You let yourself belong, if only for the space of a meal. Sometimes there would be singing, low, rhythmic, and rough, with harmonies that drifted upward into the thatched roof. The kind of song you didn't have to know to join in. It lived in you already. You'd hear it and remember a melody you were never taught. When the stars came out, cold, constant, and ancient, you'd lie on a woven mat outside, staring upward. Those stars were the same ones your ancestors watched. The same ones the gods were said to have placed in the sky like jewels. You didn't wish on them. Wishing wasn't something you did. You measured them. You traced their paths. You wondered what tomorrow would demand. Not what it would give, but what it would take. You didn't hope for miracles. You hoped for something manageable, something small. A quiet day, an uneventful night, a body that didn't ache too much. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Survival wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary, repetitive, sacred in its own way. Another day to rise, to carry, to cook, to comfort. Another night to rest, to think, to remember. Another night to keep the story going. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the monuments, not the kings, not the wars, but the quiet lives that made sure everything didn't fall apart. The hands that fed others, the voices that taught, the eyes that watched and remembered, even when no one was looking. Another day to hold the world together in ways no one ever wrote down. But that shaped everything just the same. Night in ancient Egypt carried a different kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but a soft hum of life slowing down. The breath between the day's final task and the first stir of sleep. Homes quieted. Lamps flickered. Fires burned low, sending long shadows up mud brick walls. Outside, the desert cooled, and the sky filled with stars that had watched over the Nile long before any name was spoken aloud. You might be lying beside your sisters on a mat woven from palm fibers, the dust from the day still clinging to your feet. Your skin itched from the heat, but the cool air drifting through the cracks in the wall felt like a kind hand. The air was dry, tinged with the scent of oil lamps, sweat, and baked earth. Somewhere, a baby cried. A dog barked far off. The last cart rolled down a path, wheels clicking over stone. But mostly there was stillness, a pause that the whole world seemed to take together. This was the only time the world didn't ask anything of you. No jars to carry, no flour to grind, No linen to beat, no one pulling at your sleeve, calling your name, or demanding more than you had left to give, left to. Just breath in your chest and stories in your mind. Maybe the ones your mother whispered when she wasn't too tired, or the ones you made up yourself from scraps of dreams and overheard prayers. The gods didn't sleep. That's what they said. They watched through stars and wind and the occasional rustle in the reeds. They listened to what you didn't say. You didn't fear them, not quite, but you respected the dark. The night was sacred. It belonged to things you couldn't always name. Jackals, spirits, ancestors, things that lived between moments, that passed through your home like smoke. The shadows seemed longer at night, the corners of your room deeper. Every creak felt like a whisper. You would lie still and listen, not with fear, but with attention. The kind that comes from knowing you are small and the world is wide. You might feel the presence of someone long gone, a grandmother, a neighbor, a brother who didn't make it through the last harvest. The night was where memory lived. Dreams were more than dreams. They were messages, warnings, signs. A falcon in flight might mean protection. A flood might mean change. You learned not to ignore the symbols. You learned to listen, even while sleeping. You didn't just dream in pictures. You dreamed in feelings, in echoes, in patterns you tried to hold on to after waking. And as your eyes began to close, as the warmth of the day finally gave way to something calm, you weren't just drifting. You were stepping into another world, one shaped by memory, silence, and shadow. A world older than your name, where everything meant something, and nothing was forgotten. The night held everything you didn't say out loud: regret, hope, the ache in your hands, the things you wished for, and the things you feared might come true. And somehow, in that silence, it understood. It didn't promise anything, but it listened. And for a little while, that was enough. There were few things more sacred in ancient Egypt than ritual. The rhythm of life and death revolved around it. From the first light of morning to the hush of twilight, every action had its place. Each movement, each word, each breath was part of something older, something bigger. The world wasn't chaotic. It was ordered, and order had to be kept. For girls, rituals began early. Lighting a small oil lamp at dusk wasn't just for light. It was symbolic, a way to honor the household gods, to push back the darkness, to invite peace. Your hands were taught to move with precision, not just efficiently, but reverently. There was a correct way to grind grain, a deliberate way to pour water, a careful way to sweep dust out of the home. These weren't chores. These were offerings. Every task was a thread in the fabric of harmony. You might wake before dawn to help your mother prepare for a festival. She would press cool fingers to your forehead, marking it with scented oil. You'd press flower petals into your braids, rub crushed herbs onto your skin. There would be laughter, even if the work was hard. Incense would curl through the morning air like a whisper from the gods. You'd carry baskets filled with bread, beer, maybe dried dates or onions, and place them near the family's shrine. Not because you had plenty, but because giving meant balance. Because to give, even a little, was to participate in the divine. In the temples, women had a role too, though it was limited. Some sang hymns in sacred choirs, their voices rising in the stone chambers. Others played sistra, rattling instruments made of bronze or wood, designed to echo wind and stir the spirits. The gods didn't just listen to words. They listened to rhythm, to motion. And girls were taught to keep that rhythm from the time they could walk. At home, your grandmother was a guardian of smaller, quieter rituals. You'd watch her trace protective signs over doorways using chalk or oil. Her murmurs, blended into the air. Spells, prayers, hopes. She'd teach you to place a blue bead near the sleeping mat of a sick child, to whisper the name of a healing goddess over boiling herbs. She didn't call it magic. She called it remembering. Remembering what worked, what protected, what had always been. When someone fell ill, healing wasn't just about what you applied to the skin. It was what you said, how you breathed, what you believed. Balance was the goal, between body and soul, between the seen and unseen. Illness wasn't random. It was imbalance. And healing was about restoring the lines that held the world together. Even grief had its rituals. Mourning wasn't hidden. It was loud. It was dramatic. It was necessary. You learned to wail properly, to express sorrow in a way that honored the dead and comforted the living. You tore linen in long strips. You smeared ash or red ochre on your face and arms. You didn't hide your tears. You gave them freely. The act of grieving was a ceremony in itself. To mourn was to love. The concept of Ma'at guided everything. Ma'at wasn't just a goddess. She was the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order. She was in the arrangement of stars, the turning of seasons, the weighing of the heart in the afterlife. And she lived in your actions, in how you treated others, how you worked, how you gave. Every girl, no matter how small or overlooked, was part of maintaining Ma'at. Through her steps, her voice, her hands, even when no one noticed, especially then, the world didn't thank you. But it stayed upright because of you. Somewhere deep in the halls of the temple, far from the open markets, far from the dusty courtyards and the clamor of daily life, a girl carried a basket of offerings. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool stone floors polished smooth by centuries of steps. The walls towered around her, painted in bright mineral colors, blues that refused to fade, reds the color of fresh blood, gold that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. They told stories, these walls, of gods with falcon heads, kings crowned by the divine, battles, births, journeys beyond death. But she wasn't thinking about the carvings. She was thinking about the sting of incense smoke in her throat, about the dull ache in her shoulders, about how her hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She was a temple servant, not a priestess, not a noble, not even someone whose name would be remembered. Just one of many young girls pulled into sacred service. She scrubbed the limestone floors until they shone. She hauled clay jars filled with sacred oils, water from the Nile, beer left to ferment in the dark. She arranged trays of bread shaped like birds and stars, because the gods, even the ones who lived only in statues and silence, needed to be fed. Her days began long before the sun showed its edge over the horizon, before the birds sang, before the city stirred. She moved through shadows with purpose, washing, fetching, preparing. Everything had to be precise, each movement rehearsed, drilled into her by older women whose own names had faded. The wrong gesture could offend a god. The wrong word whispered at the wrong time might bring drought, disease, disaster. So she moved with care. Grace wasn't a luxury. It was a requirement. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she paused near the entryways to the outer courtyard, where the sunlight painted the walls in gold. During festivals, the people gathered there. Women with garlands in their hair, children holding sweet cakes, musicians pounding on drums. The city celebrated, but she wasn't allowed among them. Her place was behind the scenes, behind the veil where offerings were made in silence, hidden, essential. The priests rarely spoke to her unless something had gone wrong. Her job was to be invisible, efficient. Most of the food she laid out would never be touched. It was symbolic, ritual. The bread would harden in the dry heat. The beer would turn bitter. But that wasn't the point. Each item was part of the offering. each placement a sentence in a sacred language. She had dreams, though. Quiet ones. Sometimes, as she waited outside the sanctum, she whispered the words of the hymns under her breath, mimicking the priests. Maybe one day, she thought, she'd be trusted to light the sacred flame. Maybe she'd be allowed to prepare the incense herself. Maybe, just once, she'd speak the names of the gods out loud and not be corrected. For now, she watched. She listened. She remembered. Memory was her most precious skill. The inner sanctum smelled of old wood, oil, and myrrh. The air was thick, heavy not just with incense, but with meaning. She knelt, placed the offering tray exactly where she had been taught, stepped back 3 paces. Her eyes stayed low. Her hands did not move. The gods did not speak. But the silence was full of judgment, presence, power. Sometimes she thought she felt something. A chill across her skin, a pressure in the air. She never mentioned it. That wasn't her place. When the offering was complete, she picked up the empty basket and turned. Her throat was dry. Her limbs ached. But she walked back the way she came. Quiet, steady, unseen. There were more trays to prepare, more fires to light, more ritual to serve. Without her, the rituals would falter. The wheels of devotion would grind to a halt. And in ancient Egypt, if the rituals stopped, the balance of the world could unravel. So she kept walking. She always kept walking. The temples were quiet at dusk. Columns cast long shadows across the stone floors, and the carvings, gods with falcon heads, lion faces, and serpents curling through eternity, seemed to shift with the fading light. You'd pass by on your way home, eyes lowered, feet bare, footsteps soft on the worn path. The gods were watching, even if they never spoke, even if they never moved. You could feel their presence in the thick heat of twilight, in the hum of insects, in the stillness of the air. The smell of incense drifted from the inner chambers, heavy with resin and meaning. You inhaled it deeply, even though you weren't allowed inside. Girls weren't permitted in the sanctuaries, not truly, but you still knew the rituals. You had seen the offerings laid out in careful rows, figs, bread, lotus petals, tiny carved idols. You'd watched the priests sway in rhythm to drums that thudded like distant thunder, the sound muffled by stone but unmistakable. The gods demanded attention, but mostly from men. You served them in subtler ways, through your daily work, through your obedience, through the order you helped maintain. The home was a temple too, even if no one said it aloud. A place where fire burned, bread rose, and old words were whispered to keep danger away. But belief wasn't something reserved for the elite, or for the temple walls. It was everywhere. It lived in your hands as you shaped clay pots or ground grain, in your breath when you whispered a protection spell over your younger brother, in the way your mother traced symbols of healing on your forehead when you burned with fever. Magic and faith, they weren't two things. They were the same thing, woven through every gesture, every hour, every sigh. You might tie a red thread around your wrist to keep bad spirits away, or tuck a shard of bone behind a doorway to confuse the demons that walked at night. You buried charms under thresholds. You scattered salt. You arranged your sandals a certain way so you wouldn't invite illness. Nothing was random. Every gesture meant something. Even the way you placed bread on the table, round, unburnt, with the right pattern scored across the top, carried weight. The world was always watching. Not just your neighbors, not just your family, but spirits, ancestors, forgotten gods, shadows older than the buildings around you. You weren't alone, even when you felt that way. Eyes were everywhere. Some kind, some not, but all of them, waiting. And when things went wrong, a poor harvest, a sudden storm, a child falling ill without reason, you didn't blame chance. There was no such thing. You looked inward. Had a ritual been skipped? Had a word been mispronounced in a spell? Had an offering gone stale? Had someone, knowingly or not, broken the old ways? There was fear in that, but also comfort. Because rituals gave shape to chaos, they made the world feel less cruel, less random. If you followed the rules, you might be safe. If you honored the spirits, they might protect you. Even when your own life felt small, unnoticed, uncertain. The rituals reminded you that you were part of something bigger. A rhythm older than memory. A chain of meaning that stretched back generations. You learned that rhythm early. You heard it in your mother's voice when she hummed over boiling pots. You felt it in the patterns she traced in the flour dust. You saw it in the way elders poured libations. A little water to the earth, a little to the gods, always in that order. Even laughter followed ritual. You laughed during feasts, never funerals. You sang when grinding grain, but never after sunset. Everything had a place. Everything had a time. And when night finally fell, and the stars scattered themselves across the sky like beads from a broken necklace, you lay in silence, not entirely sure if the sounds outside were jackals or something else. But you weren't afraid. Not fully. Because you had done the rituals. You had spoken the names. You had kept the world in balance, at least for one more day. And that, you thought, might be enough. In the quiet corners of temples, where the air was thick with incense and the light filtered through high stone slits, women sometimes found roles that reached beyond the domestic. These were rare, but they mattered. Temple service wasn't just for men. Some women became chantresses, singers of praise and prayer, chosen for their voices, their devotion, and sometimes their lineage. To be a chantress was to live partly in shadow, partly in light. You woke early, before the city stirred, before the market stalls opened, before the first carts rolled across the dusty roads. You washed in cold water, not for comfort, but for ritual purity. You dressed in linen robes, bleached near white, their fibers still stiff from drying in the sun. You tied your hair back simply, adorned with a string of beads if allowed. You might not have been a priest, but you held power in sound. And that meant you had to carry yourself with restraint, with calm. Your chants echoed through sacred chambers where sunlight barely reached. You sang before gods shaped in gold and stone, gods who never moved, but who watched everything. You sang of rebirth, of protection, of divine order. You repeated ancient lines that had been spoken by women long before you, and if your voice wavered, you trained it to hold steady. People listened, not to you, but through you. You were a conduit, not a performer. Most girls would never see the inside of these temples beyond the outer courtyards, where vendors sold small offerings and families prayed for health, for rain, for safe childbirth. But for a few, daughters of scribes, of artisans, of those already close to temple work, the walls opened. You didn't just learn music. You learned precision, how to breathe at the right moment, how to hold a note without wavering, how to memorize verses written in hieratic script, in languages few outside the temple could even pronounce. You weren't free, but you were part of something bigger, and that meant something. The temple complex was its own world. Inside, time moved differently. The outside heat faded into cool shadows. The clamor of labor and trade dulled behind thick stone walls. You walked on polished floors worn smooth by generations of bare feet. You moved in rhythm with bells and prayers. You kept your voice steady, even when tired, even when your stomach ached or your head throbbed. Service required stillness, dignity, repetition. You were expected to be invisible and yet precise, but even sacred work was still work. Your duties didn't end with song. You swept floors in the pre-dawn quiet. You ground incense into fine powder until your wrists ached. You assisted elder women in preparing offerings, bread, beer, oil, flowers, arranging each item with care, with intention. You helped keep order in a space meant to echo cosmic harmony. You waited and waited and waited for the moment your voice would be needed again, and when it was, you gave it fully. And yet, within that waiting, something else grew. A sense of identity, separate from marriage, from motherhood, from the constant press of family need. In the temple, you were seen differently, not just as a girl, but as a vessel, a voice, a bridge between this world and something larger. You weren't wealthy, you weren't free, but you were needed. You belonged to something old, something sacred. Outside, your life might have been defined by service to a husband, to children, to the endless grind of survival. Inside, within the columns and carvings, your voice echoed in places few others could tread. You walked beside statues of gods and flickering oil lamps, knowing that each breath you took was a continuation of rituals older than memory. And even if your name never left the temple walls, even if it wasn't etched into history, it was carried on the breath of every hymn you sang. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.